Hey everyone, it's Dom, founder and program manager of the RippleX Fellowship. Today we have Roger here with us today. He was part of our cohort 3. So Roger, why don't you give a quick intro of yourself?
Sure thing. Let's see. So I guess most relevant to this conversation, I was previously working on a startup called Finary. I was a co-founder and CEO there. We were basically building what could be described as Discord for investing, in other words, a social network for investing. Worked on that for about 3 years. We went through Y Combinator, raised venture funding. So, more than happy to go ahead and talk about things related to that.
Yep.
But beyond that, I'm currently working on the growth team at Block Party. We're an early stage startup, 7 people building anti-harassment tools. And then before all of that, I was a college student. I was at Harvard, there for 2 years studying basically tech ethics is how I describe it, but then ultimately left after my sophomore year to go start Finary. But in a nutshell, that's my background.
Actually, why don't we start with the story of how you went from becoming a person interested in venture capital? Because I remember
Right.
you're interested. You're part of the Harvard undergraduate venture capital kind of program, and then you
Yeah.
became a founder afterwards. So how did that
Right.
happen?
So when we had first met, I don't know if you remember, this was back in the fall of 2019. Uh, at the time, I was simultaneously interested in VC as well as startups. I was pretty sure at that point that I wanted to go into either one as a potential career path, but I wasn't really sure which one might be the best fit. So on one hand, I was really excited about learning more about VC. That's why I went and applied and did the Ripple Ventures program. But then on the other hand, I was trying to hack together small projects on the side with a couple of friends.
Yeah.
And ultimately, as it worked out, worked on it for a couple of months. COVID happened, ended up having way more time to now allocate towards this project, which then became an actual startup. And then fast forward a couple of months, was able to raise money and leave school to go work on it full time. But that's a
Yeah.
tidbit of the story there.
Yeah, it happened really quickly, right? Like, how tell me how did it kind of transition from becoming an idea to a little project to a real company? Like, how would you define those stages for yourself?
Yeah, so I think we spent probably a good 3 months at the beginning, kind of in the ideation stage. I think what's pretty common amongst young founders, probably most founders, is you spend a lot of time just theorizing about what you want to build. You have all these conversations around what name you want to give your product, what features it's going to have, the vision that you have for the product and the team, but you don't actually do anything tangible in terms of actually building a product. So one of the great things about COVID was we were basically kicked off of campus, had all this time, no longer had classes, homework, assignments, all the things, and actually had time to, design out interfaces, put that into code, ship the product to users, get feedback, the whole process. And then basically doing that for about 6 months throughout the beginning of COVID into the fall of COVID in 2020, then felt the need to go apply to Y Combinator, was fortunate to get in. And then from there, things were kind of a whirlwind in terms of social investing at the time, picking up a lot of traction. So, not sure if you remember, but GameStop, Wall Street Bets, meme stocks were more of a craze that then created a lot of tailwinds in terms of fundraising, getting traction with the product. So, basically, in the span of a year, where it initially started out as ideating just this concept, we were then full-fledged company, left school at that point, raised funding. So a lot had happened in 1 year's time.
Yeah, I remember when you were building, like all of that GameStop craze
Right.
was going on, and there was just so much momentum behind that market. But I want to save that for a little bit later in the
Sure.
conversation.
Yeah.
Talk me through how you decided to go apply to YC. What were you looking for in that program to get out of it, and how did that program become helpful to you?
Yeah. So I think with any given first time founding team, especially young founders, me and my co-founders at the time were probably in the ages of like 19 to 20, like very young. And when you're doing something as difficult as building a company, building a startup for the first time, there are a lot of very fundamental lessons that you need to learn. And we certainly saw YC as this place of having a lot of that background and a lot of that expertise to share, specifically with first time founders as well as young founders. And I think also, being practical and coming from a realistic perspective, they're also one of the few investors that are so willing to bet on young and early teams. There was a component to that as well. But also on another hand, like it's kind of the same rationale for why I did the Ripple Ventures program, where it's like you want to learn these very fundamental things about VC and how that world works. So that was kind of the mindset there across both of those programs. But in terms of the actual YC experience, it was pretty fantastic. was different in that at the time, because it was COVID, it was purely remote, fully on Zoom. So to a certain extent, it kind of felt like just being in school, where you're just taking these classes, going to these talks, having these meetings all virtually. But it was fantastic in that it taught you the very, very basic, let's call them lessons or best practices of startups, which is, make something people want, talk to your customers, don't focus on things like clout and social media following, stay lean, get to ramen profitability, and all these various different lessons that they've talked about endlessly over the last decade or so. But it was really nice to be able to get those very fundamental lessons, hear from some really fantastic founders like, Brian Chesky, the Collison brothers and so on. And then also really nice to be in that community of fellow founders who were building their products from that 0 to 1 stage and be able to talk about those shared experiences and problems, whether it's with fundraising, dealing with customers, being able to ship product fast enough, thinking about recruiting, all these very tactical things. But overall had a really fantastic experience with YC and would definitely recommend it to anyone who's a first-time founder, and especially those that are young founders as well.
Awesome. Would you do YC again with your next company?
Yeah, would definitely be open-minded to that. I think they provide a lot of value in terms of really enforcing and embedding those very fundamental best practices in any given venture. So I think that's why you see a number of founders do it multiple times over.
Makes sense. And let's switch gears and talk a little bit more about that market hype and kind of ups and downs of all the changes that were happening in that consumer finance and social space. Because I remember you started in the traditional stock trading era, and then you moved a little bit into that crypto space as well over time. So walk us through the different kind of markets that you played in, why you changed from different markets as well, and how the experience was seeing so much momentum and sometimes even the lack of momentum, depending on how the market was teetering and tottering.
Yeah. So I think the short answer there is we didn't actually fully get into building out pretty comprehensive crypto features. There were small things that we had added to the product. But I think the high level realization from that experience there was, at the time, there was a lot of excitement about Web3, around crypto. And as a young team that was doing it for the first time, we didn't really have that practice of being able to kind of not pay as much attention to the hype around new technologies and new spaces. And the downside of that was we were kind of focusing on these different things of, we want to go address retail investors, Gen Z retail investors, but then also people who are interested in crypto. And as a small team and as a small startup, it can be really, really difficult to do multiple different things very well. So I think the learning there was we probably should have just focused on our initial use case, nailed that first, and then thought further down the road about things to expand to. All that being said, I'm personally very, very excited about crypto and Web3, but I think in terms of sequencing our resources, it would have made much more sense to just focus on retail investing. I think what was interesting about the experience, and just probably one of those unique periods to go through relative to others, was we were in this huge, huge bubble, lots of cheap capital, let's call it, lots of hype, people being willing to kind of back anything, consumers being very willing to try new products, especially within the retail investing space, because consumers just had more money to invest, whether it was because of COVID checks, them saving up a lot of money because of COVID as well, a lot of different factors. It was very, very interesting to go from this period of like almost pure euphoria, where everyone's really happy, everyone has money to throw around, to quite literally the opposite, where you have like one of the most drastic financial downturns in the span of a year, and then you have like a global war happening and supply chain issues, inflation. It was very, very interesting to go from, in what I would describe like not easy mode, but like easier mode to extremely hard mode, and experiencing that as a first-time founder, both in terms of navigating company building, shipping product, and talking to customers, but then also more practical things like raising money and staying alive. But obviously there are things that we'll get into there as well.
And how fast did you feel that change go from that euphoria feeling all the way down to the lowest of the lows? Like, how fast did that happen? Because obviously it happened over a period of time in the markets, but from you feeling it from the customer side, was there any delay or lag in that, or was it very much in line and in tandem with how the markets were falling at that time?
Probably, yeah, pretty in tandem with actual market performance. So probably in the span of like, let's say 2 to 3 months, the change from that initial environment to the one that then followed was pretty quick. where as soon as I think it was like Russia had invaded Ukraine in maybe December 2022, markets started to tumble. And in particular with our product, it was a social investing product. So like fundamentally, if your portfolio is doing not well, but even like really, really bad because the markets are doing really, really bad, your inclination to actually look at your portfolio was much lower. And then on top of that, your inclination to then have conversations and share your portfolio performance with your friends is even lower. So not only did the macro environment change where it was just, a lot harder to gain enthusiasm around our business, but also on a more micro granular scale, it was hard to actually get or maintain our product usage because customers just didn't really want to look at their investments at that time. So very, very interesting, 2 month span where things are going pretty decently well. You're feeling pretty good and optimistic about the future. Then all these external events come out of nowhere and kind of really disrupt your business and also just the world. The other big thing there was the news around FTX and a lot of the crypto companies kind of going under. So definitely a very, let's call it a unique period to go through as a founder.
Yeah, it's interesting, so much psychology behind action and how the macro environment, when you talked about, hey, like, yeah, when the portfolio is red, you just don't want to look at it and you don't want to talk about it. And that impacts kind of how they're interacting with your tool as well. And at that time too, there was so many different trading platforms and so many social kind of media and finance applications out there. How did you navigate having so much competition in your space? Like, how did you feel going through that as like a small startup, going through YC, and then you seeing these huge companies having raised hundreds of millions of dollars with so much more marketing growth power than you? How did you navigate and thinking through that, competing against some of those larger players?
Yeah, I think the way that we thought about it and the opportunity that we had seen was that a lot of these larger companies, retail investing companies, were generally focusing on the greater market, Gen Z investors, but also mainly millennial investors. Those are typically the individuals and folks who had more capital to invest, more AUM, and therefore more profitable. But for us, coming from being young people, being Gen Z, I hate to like use these labels, but being a young person, being recently out of college, our team felt that we had a pretty deep insight into the behaviors of young investors and the improved tools and improved experience that we wanted to build for people like us. So we felt pretty good, especially, pretty early on in terms of being able to build a better product and experience for that demographic. Ultimately, there were challenges with just turning it into a sustainable business, sustainable metrics, but that was kind of the mindset going into the experience. And that's how we thought about it. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. And was it scary to go up against those? Like at a given time, did your customers also use like multiple platforms at once? Were you trying to fight for their time away from those other tools? Like, how did you experience that?
So the initial approach that we had taken was to be very collaborative with other platforms. So we had initially started up by building the social component of the experience, where you have these group chats where you have integrated investing tools and are able to see your friends' portfolios, send live updating charts and stocks, and then simply just integrate your third-party brokerage. So whether you had Robinhood, TD Ameritrade, Schwab, etc., you could simply port that data over and enjoy the social investing experience. It was then probably about 2 years into the company that we got a bit more, let's call it combative, where we then built our own internal brokerage service, which then put us in direct competition and made things a little bit more difficult. And then there were plenty of learnings from that point on in terms of like what CAC looks like for consumer fintech products, which is just absolutely insane, just being able to compete on that front. But interesting learnings in terms of starting out as collaborative and then going into a bit more competitive positioning down the road.
Talk more about that. Like, what was that CAC for fintech consumer products? How did you guys compare to other companies in that space? What were the challenges in trying to win market share without as much capital to deploy?
Yeah, simple answer is that it was very, very challenging. So if you look at a company like Robinhood, they have pretty decently high CACs where they're very willing to go spend lots of money on Facebook ads, billboards, expensive referral fees, where if you have a friend sign up for the platform, you get X amount of dollars. Being able to compete against these very well-funded large public companies was very, very challenging, especially when, in their case, they already have monetization built in. They already have the infrastructure and licensing to be able to generate revenue from their customers. For us being a startup, and also using kind of outsource investing infrastructure or brokerage infrastructure, we didn't have that monetization baked in. And it was going to be a number of probably years before we were able to make that happen. So we were spending a lot of money to acquire customers, and on the back end didn't even have a way to monetize. And the strategy there was, in the long run, you'll be able to then monetize, but you want to acquire your customers first. But then again, like when you're in a pretty constrained environment where capital is more expensive and less accessible, being able to fundraise for that is just naturally more difficult. I think the other component to that is if you think about the large incumbents within the brokerage space, those beyond Robinhood, so Charles Schwab, Fidelity, they have even more money, huge companies, private companies, if anything, and therefore are able to spend way more, especially because their customer base are high net worth individuals. So yeah, just very, very challenging in terms of being able to compete on CAC with a lot of these different platforms. There were different distribution methods that we had experimented with that were just cheaper and that we felt would be good ways of getting customers. So doing things like a college ambassador program, being pretty active on social media, working directly with investing creators, going directly to investing communities all across the internet and finding users that way. Ultimately, we weren't able to make it work, didn't have enough time to make things work, but certainly a lot of learnings in terms of being able to go up against these incumbents with much larger budgets and trying to compete.
So what would you do differently next time around if you were building kind of the same tool or playing also in a very competitive market space? Like what would you do differently to make sure you can get over the hump or have enough time and resources to try to compete?
Probably would have, hindsight 2020, probably would have restructured the product such that there was a very strong core utility that wasn't as, let's call it frivolous. I'm not even sure if I'm using the word frivolous in the right way here, but let's call it frivolous in terms of regardless of how markets are performing, the user isn't just going to immediately churn or go away for an extended period of time. So restructuring the product that way, that's a very broad description, but at a meta level, that's how I would describe it. Baking in monetization a lot earlier, such that you then actually have a tangible budget to go out and acquire users on. That probably would have been more sustainable. In retrospect, I wish we had done that as soon as possible, as early as possible. But again, lessons learned from the first time around.
Yeah. Was that even possible though? Because you talked about setting up that brokerage and you have to get through some steps before you can actually monetize. Like, are you talking about like subscription monetization?
Right.
Or more of that? Okay, got it.
So at the time, our planned business model was to make or generate revenue off of brokerage services. So things like payment for order flow, interest on your assets on the platform, your portfolio, very standard ways of making money in the brokerage space. What we probably should have done in retrospect was bake in, like you mentioned, things like premium subscription features. Maybe that's like enhanced data analytics, access to certain types of exclusive content, whatever it might have been. Baking in that monetization such that we just weren't spending money to not get any money back in the short run.
When you first started this business, what would be one piece of advice that you would give yourself?
Talk to customers. Talk to customers as much as you can. Ultimately, the most valuable asset, I think, in product building is feedback and insights. If you're fundamentally solving a problem for a customer or a set of customers, your ability to build a really great product, build a fantastic experience, get them to actually pay for it, and then use those funds to grow your business, grow your distribution, whatever it might be. It's all driven by really good insights and really good feedback. So talk to customers as much as you can.
Awesome. Great. And that's a great note to end off on. Thank you so much, Roger, for sharing your tips and insights and battle stories about building Finary. Appreciate having you in the ecosystem. Thank you so much, Roger.
Sure thing.